Hello and welcome to the Dr. Suzette Glassner podcast. Please don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you want to continue to learn from me. Recently, country singer Jelly Roll appeared on the Pivot podcast and has been very outspoken about the impact of addiction on his family. He has historically been very open about his own journey in recovery and through addiction. But recently, he spoke about his daughter Bailey and the way her mother Felicia's recent drug felony charges really profoundly affected his daughter. He described the way in which family is often the victim of someone's addiction, and it's not just that person with addiction themselves. And I think this is a good reminder to all of us that addiction has impacts that extend beyond the person themselves who is trying to find their way through it. It really affects all the people who are close to that individual, the family members, coworkers, friends. In fact, we have some recent statistics from a study on, of course, the most extreme form of impact in relation to overdose deaths. There were several thousand people who were surveyed in that study out of Johns Hopkins, and what they found was that nearly a third of those who were surveyed knew somebody who had died of a drug overdose. And out of those individuals, around 80 million people, nearly 1 in 5 had experienced an overdose death among a close family member or a loved one. And you can imagine for some people, this would be super unexpected and out of the blue. But for others, they've been along for the whole journey and all the struggles of the ups and downs of the addiction along with their loved one. And so I wanted to share with you 3 things to think about if you are close to someone or if there's somebody in your family who has addiction. The first one is that it's not your fault. People often blame themselves when a person who's close to them, whether that's their child, their sibling, their spouse, their parent, turns to drugs and alcohol and gets into a situation where their use of the substance takes over their life. People who are close to an individual who's going through that often wonder, what could I have done differently? Why did this happen? Where did I go wrong? And that guilt can really eat you up inside. No one person causes another person's addiction. That's not how it works. It's pretty complicated, and it's a lot of things at play that lead a person to become addicted to something, and I'm going to talk about what they are. Probably the best way for you to believe me about that is to become more educated than you are today. Some of you will have read up a lot about addiction before watching today's episode. Some of you don't know too much. So get educated about the subject of addiction. My recent book, Addiction: What Everyone Needs to Know, is a very good starting point for that because it takes you through what causes a person to become addicted, who's vulnerable to addiction and why, and how addiction is treated. So that's just one resource, but there are others, the National Institutes of Health, and in particular, the National Institute on Drug Abuse or the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. Both are great resources online for just basic information about what causes addiction. But the point that it's not your fault is one that has been very well studied and very clearly demonstrated in scientific research. So that's not just me saying it to make you feel better. Here are a couple of things that you can keep in mind about what causes addiction. First of all, it's a lot of different things, but among them is genetics. Genetics account for 40 to 60% of the risk of becoming addicted to something. So some of this we're born with. Of course, not everyone who's born with this genetic vulnerability to become addicted becomes addicted. So there are other things that will influence the likelihood that they will develop what we call a substance use disorder. One of them is a history of trauma early in life. Another one is mental health difficulties. That also places a person at risk for a substance use disorder. Another one that parents may blame themselves for, but again, it's not a one-to-one, this explains everything, but is exposure to people who are drinking or using substances early in life. That could be a parent, that could be a sibling, but again, that's one factor. So that exposure in and of itself is not going to explain completely why somebody went on to develop an addiction. It typically is paired with other what we call risk factors or things that make a person more likely to develop an addiction, and those are things like the genetic vulnerability, psychological problems, trauma. Some of it is temperament and personality. So some people are a little bit more likely to want to seek out new sensations. You might have heard them called thrill seekers, but sensation seeking or thrill seeking, that's one type of temperament that can make somebody more vulnerable to developing addiction. And then there's also our biological response to alcohol or other substance use. There's a number of studies that have shown that some people have what we call a low response to alcohol, for example, meaning that the first time they try try alcohol, it doesn't really do much unless they drink a lot. And people who have to consume large amounts of a substance in order to feel anything, they're pre-wired to respond to alcohol in that way, because you put one person in a room and give them alcohol for the first time, they have one drink and they feel very dizzy, or they feel very intoxicated, or they feel very good. You put another person next to them and they need 5 times as much to feel anything. That's a biologically determined way of responding to a substance. That also plays into a person's vulnerability to addiction. So bottom line, it is not your fault, and you cannot blame yourself for a person close to you developing an addiction. Even if some aspect of your behavior played some role in it, it's not a one-to-one relationship, and you have to keep that in mind. And if you feel you did contribute to it, forgive yourself so that you can be of help to that person. The second is around treatment. So getting help from a professional for your loved one can be the most impactful step that you take, because your help and support and love can only take a person so far. But I just want to share with you some of the things that are benefits of and the focus of treatment for a substance use disorder, because for a lot of people who don't know, like, well, what is treatment going to do exactly? Is it going to change their brain somehow? Is it going to make them unaddicted? Here are some of the things that we do in treatment for a substance use disorder. First of all, we do a lot of education. Why do I do something over and over again that I know is so self-destructive, and it hurts me and it hurts the people around me? A person who is struggling with a substance use disorder is asking themselves and asking people around them, I don't know why I do this. Well, we teach based on how we understand it scientifically, the way that substances alter the brain, the way that substances and chronic substance use can impact a person's reasoning and judgment and decision making. We help them understand the why behind how they've come to this point where they've developed a substance use disorder. And that understanding is really important for a lot of people. Then we help them to understand their addiction almost like it was its own human personality. There are going to be times when the addiction is going to run really rampant and it's going to take over. And that's in the face of certain triggers. So we help you understand what are the specific triggers that make you more likely to use substances in a given situation. So sometimes those triggers can be emotional. They can be internal, when I feel angry, when I feel tired, when I feel lonely, when I'm bored. We help people to understand what those triggers are. And then we help them to develop coping strategies that are healthy to respond to that. So let's say a person, when they feel depressed, is when they're most likely to drink. Well, drinking is a way of trying to self-medicate that state of depression. So what we'll do in treatment is we'll try to help them identify healthier ways that they can cope with that depression and get through it without doing something that's actually in the long run going to make the depression worse, like consuming alcohol, which is a depressant. Because life as it is right now, when a person comes into treatment, is somehow reinforcing or making some of those addictive behaviors more likely. Things are set up in a way in their life, whether it's the accessibility of alcohol or other drugs in their environment, the people that they're spending time with, the sort of life problems that they're dealing with that may not be resolved, but could be better resolved. And we help a person to re-envision their life in recovery and figure out what needs to change. The people they're spending their time around, the way that they're spending their time, the way that they structure their time. There's a lot that goes into mapping out a life that's free from alcohol and drugs when you have been using alcohol or substances for such a long time in very particular ways that are really woven into your life. And then we're helping you to prevent slips or relapses. And we're also trying to help you figure out whether there's another diagnosis that could be complicating things. So I mentioned some people drink when they're depressed, some people drink when they're anxious, some people drink when they're really happy. But by figuring out whether there's anything clinically diagnostically that may be tied in with substance use, maybe it's a pain condition that you're trying to self-medicate, maybe it's a mental health condition, maybe it's a relationship dynamic that is really toxic that you need to work on or revisit or reevaluate. But in general, one of the areas of important work that a clinician can do to help somebody in treatment for a substance use disorder to come out of it with effective ways of coping and to effectively change their substance use long term is to figure out the diagnostic puzzle. If there's anything else going on that's contributing to this that we need to manage and get under control in order for you to be successful. My piece of advice number 3 that's very important is you need to get support for yourself. Because as I mentioned, living with somebody and loving somebody who has a substance use disorder has a lot of ups and downs. It can feel very much like a roller coaster. You can have very intense emotional responses to all the different things that happen, even in the course of a day. You're dealing with a lot of mistrust sometimes as you're trying to help your loved one to get their substance use under control. They may be lying about it. You may be really preoccupied as you go about your day with worries and concerns about what's going to happen next, especially if you've been in and out of navigating crises. This is a very lonely and isolating kind of feeling when there's nobody to talk to who really understands. And again, there's so much stigma around substance use and substance use disorders and addiction that often it's hard to find that confidant who's not going to make you feel judged, who's not going to give you more advice than you really wanted, and who's just going to be a great listener and give you advice when you need it, or give you valued advice that's not confusing. There are self-help groups that can be helpful, like Al-Anon, and then there is professional help seeking out the assistance of somebody who is an addiction specialist. That could be a counselor, that could be a psychiatrist, that could be a therapist. There are different types of professionals who specialize in substance use disorders, diagnosis, and treatment. And it's really important that you feel fully supported as you're navigating the ups and downs of this process. The National Institutes of Health and the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, also known as SAMHSA, and the NIH have a lot of great resources online for support and understanding how to navigate a family member's difficulty, but also really seeking out professional help can be very impactful so that you don't feel like you have to walk through this alone, because truly you're not alone. There are so many people who are struggling with substance use disorder. And for every person who has a substance use disorder, there are so many people who love that person who are going through exactly what you might be. So I hope you learned something valuable today and you're able to follow my 3 perspectives and pieces of advice in order to make your life better and to help improve the life of a loved one who has a substance use disorder. Thank you for being here, and I will see you next time.